Folks, on the line today we've got Peter Klein, who was with Meridian Economics. You'll be aware of Meridian Economics because they were in the news recently and produced a report about the sort of the energy futures of South Africa, or the electricity futures of South Africa. As you know, we're in the middle of some load shedding, and which has just been curtailed, and it's all part of the issue of insufficient supply to meet the demand. During the work that Peter was doing, he became involved in the establishment of an energy modeling system that I'm hoping that he will speak to us more about. And perhaps, Peter, at the end, if you can just share some thoughts on the modeling that you did or that was done at Meridian in the South African context. Folks, I bumped into Peter a while back at CSIR when I was having a chat with Clinton and Jared, and he sort of passed by fleetingly, and it seems like he is worth more than a fleeting look. He has a PhD in mechanical engineering and comes from the CSIR Energy Center, and he's now at Meridian Economics as a senior engineer. Over the last 12 years, Peter's developed expertise in both thermal energy and renewable energy systems, with a strong focus on modeling and optimization at both system level and for specific processes. He's currently working on the development of this open source power system model for South Africa using the PyPSA platform. So, Peter, your CV speaks for itself, and we are dying to hear what you have to say today. So please continue. The floor is yours.
Great. Fantastic. Thanks, Marcus. Yeah, so my background is I'm actually predominantly was involved in thermal energy, having done my postgraduate studies in high temperature heat storage, originally looking at sort of the role that could play in the CSP industry, but then subsequently in my time at the CSIR Energy Center, then doing a lot of work with industrial facilities, looking at how they can optimize specifically their thermal systems, and then for applications such as waste heat recovery, steam boiler analysis, and so forth. And during that time, started to my time at the Energy Center get very interested in power system modeling, and obviously I think the work that Jared and Joanne and the rest of the team did during their time at the CSIR Energy Center. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. I think my aim for this presentation is really to give you a little bit of an overview of a project that we've recently started at Meridian Economics. And I'll start off with a little bit of a background to why we really believe in the concept of open energy modeling. I'll then provide a little bit of an overview of the specific framework that we are using, which is PyPSA. I'll then introduce you to the project that we are working on and some of our objectives and timelines. And I think most importantly, where there are touch points for collaboration. I think collaboration is the main sort of driver for this open energy work. And you'll see that there's definitely some areas where load research can play a very important role. And then finally, I'll just provide a short overview of some of the recent PyPSA modeling that we did for some of our load shedding work. So, I mean, energy system modeling is a very broad term, and it can cover many different aspects of an energy system. So I think from my perspective, we're really using tools to study both the design and operation of an energy system. I think we're all aware of the process that we go through in South Africa, the National Integrated Resource Plan. And I think just to drive home the importance of having an evidence base that can support decision makers into which technology should be deployed in order to meet specific objectives. So if this is decarbonization, security of supply, and energy system costs. So typically, the primary objective of integrated resource planning is to ensure that there's energy security moving forward, and typically that this can be provided either at least cost or where there are policy adjustments to least cost for example, decarbonization aspects and so forth. I really like this quote that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think it really is a solution space, and often an optimizer will give you a single solution, but it's really about exploring the impact of different inputs into really, I mean, it's a very complicated space, and often you're trying to project over multiple decades. So there's a high degree of uncertainty in the inputs that go into these models. So it's really about understanding rather the solution space and how these inputs interact with each other for different scenarios moving forward. So in terms of an overview of the different types of models, I think we start with the one that people are most aware of, and that's really the capacity expansion planning. And that's looking at what are the generation, storage, and transmission investments that are going to be required. And that's typically done over years to decades in terms of the time horizon. Then if we look at a step down from that, once you have a set of resources, then looking at what is production cost and resource adequacy, and that might be anywhere between a day to a year, and it can be down to sort of 5-minute time intervals or typical hourly modeling. And then we start to get into more of the power flow and transient stability modeling, and then you're starting to get down to very short time periods. So typically, when we're talking about energy system modeling, the work that we are focused on is really around these two first bullet points around the capacity expansion and then production cost resource adequacy. So in terms of what actually goes into one of these models, really, essentially what you're building is a linear programming. So it's a linear modeling world that can either be mixed integer linear programming. So if you have things like unit commitment, or it can just be linear relaxed. And typically the objective function is to minimize costs for a different scenario. So these costs will be a sum of annualized capex costs as well as marginal costs, and then finding what is the optimal investment point to minimize over that time horizon. The typical inputs that go into this model include historical load data. Typically, we're working in hourly increments. So historical, what the profile looks like, and then also projections in terms of how's the load profile projected to grow over time. On a national level, this tariff structure block doesn't play too much of a role, but we also do this for industrial customers where Eskom is kind of seen as a generator, and then we would want to understand what their tariff structures are and how that tariff structure could change over time. And then really details around different generation and storage technologies, ranging from doing resource assessments, and then having a good view on what the conversion efficiencies, most importantly, capital costs and operating costs. And really, many of these technologies are still coming down a learning curve, especially for battery energy storage, and what kind of role that can play. And then essentially coming out of this model, we would really be aiming to answer the question, what is the mix of technologies and when to invest in specific technologies? If we're doing this more at an industrial site level, then we would also be looking at some of the financial metrics and then also operational insights, especially around dispatchable generators, battery storage, what the best way to operate certain mix of assets would be. So this is currently a small version of our model that we use to assist many of our industrial clients. It's essentially a two-node model that allows for both on-site generation and off-site generation with wheeling through the grid. So essentially we have a demand profile that needs to be satisfied over time, depending on where the site is located, what kind of available space they have, what different resources they have. We would then optimize what their investment should be in their own technologies. Most importantly, we have implemented the Eskom wheeling tariff and the rules of that wheeling tariff exactly in the optimization. So essentially, any energy that goes through the grid to the end client is then billed at megaflex tariff per time of use bracket. and then you get credited at the WEPS rate for different wheel generators. And then really the constraint that you can't wheel more in a time of use period than your demand. So we've been using this model for quite a few customers, just trying to understand this balance between on-site, off-site generation and what different optimal mixes could look like. So when we talk about open modeling, there's really two aspects to this, and the first is around open data, and this is really around data that is publicly available. There's been lots of inputs from different stakeholders. There's nothing in that data that is obscured, so this data can be thoroughly interrogated. And then the second part of that is then open source modeling, and having models where essentially you can see all the source code, you can see all the assumptions, how different parts and components are implemented in that model. So you essentially start with a process that is completely transparent. And I think historically, a lot of this has been done in commercial tools, with Plexos being the most well-known one that's used by many utilities and governments around the world for planning, and used in South Africa as well for the National Integrated Resource Plan. But essentially, one of the issues with these commercial tools is that they're really very closed in nature. So due to sort of license fees, it's essentially a black box to people outside of the organization doing the modeling. So it's very difficult to critique how the models are structured. Yes, there is some transparency in terms of assumptions, but actually the nitty-gritty within the model itself, it's difficult to completely interrogate that. So in terms of open source, there really are a vast number of different tools out there. I think almost every major research organization around the world has their own version of an open source platform. And some of these, some examples of these, predominantly most of these softwares are based in Python, but Balmoral, Calliope, I have no idea how to say that, Osmosis, PyPSA, PandaPy Switch, these are sort of some of the main tools that are out there. We spent some time evaluating quite a few of these different tools. We've tried out a number of them, and we have ultimately settled on PyPSA for the model that we are building. So PyPSA isn't necessarily a single model. It's more a toolbox of modules that can be used for different power system planning studies. So it includes multi-horizon investment planning for capacity expansion. You can do unit commitments of conventional generators, time-varying renewables, storage units, and most importantly, it's very well suited to sector coupling. So once you start to look beyond just the electricity sector into different aspects such as process heating, transport, and then sort of the hydrogen economy as well. In our testing, we really found that PyPSA is one of the most streamlined open source tools, and it does everything a lot in sort of pandas and the kind of standard Python module. So it makes getting to grips with the code quite easy. There's also quite a large community and existing models that can be tailored. So essentially not looking to reinvent the wheel from scratch and start a whole new model. So PyPSA is more the platform or the framework, but then there are a growing number of models that are built on top of that framework. So some of the I think most impressive applications of PyPSA is the PyPSA Europe model. And really, this is an interconnected European power system model that I think in some of the larger cases, they optimize up to 118 different nodes across the European continent, and looking at different spatial distributions of renewables at these different nodes, as well as co-optimizing the transmission network. So not only looking at generation and storage assets, but then also the different trade-offs between strengthening the grid in areas and placement of renewables in optimal resource areas. So PyPSA Europe is probably the most developed model to date. The newer version of that is a fully sector coupled model that is still under development, but it's sort of initial versions of this model are available. And this is really looking at kind of intermediary connections to hydrogen, natural gas networks, and then how that couples to process heating and transport as end demand for energy. In the South African the South African context, there's two initiatives where PyPSA models have been utilized. So PyPSA Africa, or PyPSA Meets Africa, is an attempt to do what PyPSA Europe does. So a continental model of the African power system. So this is a project that is kind of under development still. The kind of first phase of the model has been released on GitHub, but initial work on that has been doing a lot of efforts around trying to understand the existing network topology, doing a lot of work around OpenStreetMaps, as well as machine learning from satellite images to kind of track transmission lines and substations and so forth. And then finally, there is an existing PyPSA model of South Africa, and this is really the kind of base model that we are developing our code on top of. So called PyPSA-ZA. It's essentially a highly spatially distributed model. So it takes into account the 27 Eskom supply areas. So essentially there's a single node placed in each of these supply areas where capacity can be optimized, so deployment of different generators at that node, and then also taking into account a linearized form of the power flow between these nodes and trying to optimize, what does the grid look like between them? At the moment, the model solves for just a single year, so it's set up to optimize for 2040. It runs full chronology, which means it runs every hour in the year for the 27 nodes. This was first developed actually by my colleague Joanne Calitz, with one of the developers from overseas. It's first published in 2017. So essentially, we are looking to use this as a basis and then do further development. It could be from, there's really two aspects that we want to take. So the first is adding a multi-horizon capacity expansion to it. Typically, as you start to expand the analysis in terms of doing more years of analysis, it becomes too computationally intensive to try run full chronology for each one of those periods, with the simulation times just increasing exponentially. So looking at doing some form of temporal clustering where you can start to statistically sample representative days or weeks. We are adding a lot more detail around the coal fleet EAF, and also as the model was developed back in 2017, there's some code base that can be updated. So this is, for example, some of the results that initially came out of that model, and you can see then the areas for transmission expansion, as well as the kind of spatial distribution of generators across the grid. And I think the kind of spatial distribution aspect is one that really could need more focus moving forward. I think especially given some of the grid constraints, especially in the Northern Cape, really understanding, instead of having a single node model, understanding this distribution of resources across the grid is going to become increasingly important. So a little bit of a snapshot of what we are aiming to do with our project. So this is a project that is donor funded from European donors to really look at setting up this kind of updated version of that model, which will be publicly available for anyone to use. So the first sort of work activity is around updating the code base with any kind of more recent changes from PyPSA Europe. We've spent quite a lot of time looking at what the best solver is to utilize. So that is the one caveat with a lot of these open source models, is you can set up a problem that can be solved, but you still need an efficient tool that can actually numerically solve those governing equations. So there are free solvers that are available out there, but typically the problem size is quite limited. We've kind of done an evaluation test of different commercial solvers, as well as cloud-based options that are not as onerous in terms of costs. We then are in the process of updating the PyPSA model, and then also really adding this. At the moment, we're busy coding the multi-expansion part. And we've been spending some time looking at it from, if we're going to do perfect foresight, which is essentially the model can see the entire optimization window at once. So it knows ahead of time what would happen in 2040, for example, or more of a myopic expansion view where the model doesn't, it only sees the year that it is optimizing, and then it carries those existing assets into the next year until they ultimately get decommissioned. So this is something that we are hoping to have out relatively soon, probably in the next 2 months or so. And then really the kind of big task is then around making sure that we validate this open source model against existing studies. So I think the CSRR work around the RP provides a very good validation test case. All the input assumptions are very transparent, and they kind of provide quite a lot of detail on the output modeling. So our aim is to try to recreate those RP studies and see how the results compare to those that were obtained with commercial code. Ultimately, we want to move this to a sector-coupled version, especially given a lot of the interest around green hydrogen in the country. So that's kind of a future to-do list for development. And then also try contribute to the community development in the country. There are kind of a number of, I saw there's from UCT, there's a postgraduate course coming out now where they're going to be using PyPSA for some of that work. And the aim is really to make some training material that you could give to postgraduate students to set them up quite quickly, and then ultimately that they can start contributing to the code development itself. I think masters and PhD level students are a very valuable resource in the space, and they have the time to do a lot more development work than I think some of us do. So I think this is from our side our plea for help to the Node Research chapter, and these are kind of some of the areas where I think it would really be great to collaborate. The first is around understanding better what the spatial distribution of load across the country is. So the existing PyPSA model at the moment, I can't remember if it's GDP or population based, but essentially they cluster each one of those 27 supply areas. They kind of normalize it. I think it's by population. And then the load is kind of spread between those supply areas. So I think in order to do better spatial distribution modeling, it would really be great to kind of get insights of kind of what the load centers look like across the country. I think one of the biggest challenges is around forecasting demand, especially I think in the kind of short to medium term, and understanding what are we likely to see. And I think while load shedding exists, it's very difficult to look at demand, because the system almost becomes self-regulating in that as your load starts to grow and there's insufficient capacity, then load shedding really just keeps bringing that demand back to what the system can supply. But I think in the longer term, understanding what some of those changes are going to be, as we start to then move into more sector coupled work and a bit more detailed, instead of aggregating kind of at a national level, understanding the different types of load profiles for different customer categories and residential, commercial, and most importantly, I think the industrial sectors. And I know there's been a lot of great work done in this space by Marcus and the team when they're at ESCOM. And then, I think the idea is for this to be open source code. So once we have a stable beta version, really to collaborate on code development, and happy to share the kind of little bit of learning that we have so far from going through this process from scratch ourselves. So I'm going to just then jump into some preliminary modeling that we did for 2 studies that we recently released. And just show how we could do quite a lot of analysis with a relatively simple dispatch model. So I think we shouldn't always want to jump to the most complex time and intensive model development. It's often, as modelers, that's the most interesting part, but I think really often a simple model can really give a lot of important insights. So the 2 studies, I will circulate the slide deck afterwards so that you will be able to follow the links. But we really released 2 studies that looked at load shedding. So the first part was sort of a retrospective analysis and understanding where we take empirical data from ESCOM, we take the actual generation from renewables, and we scaled that up by a certain amount, and understand what that impact would have had on the grid. And I think there are really some startling results that came out of that really showed that almost we could have eliminated most of load shedding if we had around 5 gigawatts of renewables on the grid. And the kind of simplicity of that analysis is that it's using actual historical real world data. So you can't argue, yes, renewables are variable and all sorts of integration issues. And I mean, it's really taking the actual data. And sometimes I think we forget that renewables are being added to an existing power system. And there are assets on that power system that are currently being underutilized, especially the pumped hydro storage assets, just because we really don't have enough energy in the system. So this energy shortage is then becoming these capacity issues as well. So the second part of the analysis is where we did a little bit more studies in PyPSA using our dispatch model. And this was sort of a forward-looking view that we take a view on the current initiatives that are underway. So the risk mitigation, round 5, round 6, and making some different assumptions about how that capacity will come online, and looking at different scenarios to test, is that capacity going to be sufficient to address load shedding up to 2026. So I'm just going to start with the historical analysis. So this is really as we scale up the renewable capacity. Again, this is based on the exact profiles of the renewables that were present on the system for 2021. So if we scale those up to about 5 gigawatts, really looking at around 90, I think it's 96% or so that we could eliminate in terms of load shedding. We also looked at some other impacts, so in terms of peaking capacity, and that was really around if we increase the amount of diesel storage at the peaking plants, what effect that would have. And in this analysis, we never let the pumped hydro storage assets drop to a dam level that is below how ESCOM actually operated them in that time. And I think the startling outcome of this result is that we could have reduced this load shedding and we would have still seen a net saving to ESCOM in the order of 2.5 billion rand. And that's purely through reduction in diesel consumption for the peaking plants. So what the dispatch model that we used for this work actually looks like. It's a single node model where essentially we model different generator types as an aggregated generator. So we didn't model each of the coal plants separately. They're modeled as one coal unit, but we do have ramping constraints. So the fleet is not allowed to ramp at more than what Eskom actually achieved in 2021. In terms of pumped hydro storage, it's split, so we have upper and lower dams. We also, for the pump storage assets that are used for water transfer, some of that is included in the model as well as extra inflow into the dams. On the OCGT side, we did try our best to model diesel storage. So we don't allow the OCGTs to sort of just run and assume that fuel is always available. So we have a diesel refuel rate, which we calibrated to 2021 and sort of in the order of 27 megaliters of diesel storage. The model also includes reserve requirements. So we have those sort of 2.2 gigawatts of reserve that must be available from a combination of the pump storage assets plus the diesel storage plus any battery backup. And we also have fast acting reserves that can only be supplied. I think we used up to a gigawatt for pumped hydro storage and any battery storage assets that are added to the grid. So we really spent a lot of time to calibrate this model to the data from 2021 and got actually a sort of within 1 or 2% of the actual load shedding. So essentially, when there's unserved energy, then that's represented as load shedding. So what this dispatch model does is it provides a relatively good view of how the system operator would operate a different fleet of resources in order to try to minimize costs as well as any load shedding events. And obviously, if there is insufficient capacity online, then trying to minimize that impact. In terms of the forward-looking view, we modeled a range of different scenarios, particularly around the coal fleet EAF, as well as what demand could do over the next sort of 4 years. So I think it's a graph that many people would have seen. Unfortunately, Eskom doesn't publish the coal EAF in isolation. It kind of publishes the entire fleet EAF. So we had to do a little bit of back calculating to try work out what the contribution from the coal fleet was. And really seeing kind of this trend of about 2% per year compounded, decreasing and looking even worse year to date. And I think the real challenge is when we look at the assumptions that were the input assumptions to RP 2019 is that the coal fleet EAF would already be above 70% to date. So we really looked at some different trajectories. So if this could stabilize compared to if we continue along this track, what could happen? This little bump that you see in EAF here is there to simulate the return to service of one unit at Medupi after repairs. In terms of demand, obviously with COVID, a significant drop in demand. There's been some recovery, and ultimately, if we were looking at growing the economy, we need to be looking at planning for an energy system that can accommodate a growth in demand. I think so. Ultimately, our solution case, we're looking at targeting being able to supply for a 1% growth in demand. But in the base case, we also did look at if demand remains flat or even if demand decreases over time. So in order to kind of analyze the base case, which is really what is the existing resources that we expect to come onto the grid over this time, we we started off by assuming that only 50% of bid window 5 solar projects will reach financial close, and 70% of wind projects will reach financial close. So the kind of underlying assumption behind this is really twofold. Local content issues on solar PV plants, and then for both solar PV and wind, issues around the kind of global energy crisis that we're seeing, and really rapidly rising prices. So many of these projects were very aggressively bid, and that's I think now the kind of growth and costs of some of these technologies. There's a real risk that many of them won't reach financial close without some kind of intervention. We then assumed that bid window 6 projects can reprice some of that risk in, so all of those would come online, but limited again to the size of bid window 6 with no increase in size. In terms of risk mitigation, we looked at only the projects that didn't have imported gas, and 375 megawatts of firm capacity, and those generators are not reported as separate solar PV, wind and storage generators. Essentially, they're kind of this lump generator, and it will follow the 5 a.m. to, I think it's 9:30 in the evening generation profile. So yeah, and then we did assume that some expansion of the diesel storage could be added. So it essentially, in terms of results, we analyzed 2 cases. So the first case is that there are no further delays to commissioning of new units at Kusile, as well as no further delays on the Kuberg steam turbine replacements. And this is really a matrix of demand and EAF assumptions over time. So if we see green colored blocks, that's really load shedding is essentially resolved. Orange colored blocks, it's up to about the 1.8 terawatt hours. And then anything light or even worse, dark red is significant risk of load shedding. And I think it's only really looking at scenarios with flat or decreasing demand and no further decline in the coal fleet EAF that we see that there are not significant levels of load shedding. So I think essentially our conclusion from this work is that in most plausible scenarios, as the coal fleet EAFs continues to come off, and even for flat demand, there's really a significant risk of load shedding without different interventions that can be made. So, of course, the aim of the paper was to provide kind of insights and some recommendations from our side. So our managing director, Javier Stein, is very involved in that space. But essentially, the aim would be to distribute those risks. So instead of having a central procurement process to try spread what needs to be done in terms of installation of new renewables across as many different economic actors as possible. So definitely continue with the centralized government procurement programs under REAP. In terms of risk mitigation, we're recommending that at the moment, because the projects have to be sized to provide that specific firm capacity, there is essentially a huge amount of overbuild. So if we take the projects that have signed PPAs, the actual size of the solar installed capacity is significantly larger than the committed firm capacity. So one of our recommendations there is really we need all the capacity we can, and we should not be curtailing a single kilowatt hour of energy, and also to give Eskom access to the storage assets and the battery storage assets for control. Looking at doing what can be done to increase the likelihood of bid window 5's closing, and then significantly expand the size of bid window 6. We have a narrow window of time in order to get more capacity online before 2026, when we start to really see the coal fleet start to be decommissioned. So to push the size of bid window 6, and then really a significant part of the solution coming from uptake within the sort of distributed market and the 1 megawatt and 100 megawatt sizes of plants. So essentially, this is kind of our risk-adjusted scenario. So you can see that a significant amount of the proposed capacity is to come from solar PV assets, and that's really due to the kind of lead time to get new capacity online. We need new capacity as soon as possible, and solar PV gives a great opportunity in that space. But we do recommend as an insurance policy the installation of about 1.5 gigawatts of peaking capacity that can be used as an insurance policy should some of the targets around renewable installations not be achieved. This just kind of gives you a snapshot of the base case and the solution case and how the energy mixes change. Naturally, you wouldn't have this much load shedding from this capacity gap. Essentially, you'd be kind of forcing or limiting any energy demand growth. So this is both for 1% per year growth in demand. But you can start to see the famous duck curve coming into play, especially with this kind of solar heavy focus in the kind of short term in terms of rushing getting capacity online. So we did double check the results. We did quite a few different studies with limiting the ramp rates on the coal fleet, and surprisingly, what the model does is it's just optimizing then around that ramp rate, and it's using the pump storage and possibly peaking assets slightly different. But we didn't see a huge difference in the results when we halved the potential ramp rates on the coal fleet. So definitely something that we believe should be attainable. So yeah, that's I think everything from my side. So if I don't know if I went over time there, but happy to chat further, and yeah, if anyone's interested in collaboration, we really are kind of excited about that. Thanks, Marcus.
Thanks very much, Peter. Peter, we have a couple of questions sitting here. I myself have a number of questions. I just want to get to a question that was raised about the models. Mr. Ntikulu has asked, do you use the NREL models?
I'm not 100% sure which NREL model you're talking about there. You're talking about the cost projections from NREL, or specifically their modeling tools?
Yeah, I think we must ask him to just clarify. If you can come in now, just clarify which NREL models you're talking about. Okay, I've no response.
I can maybe just give a little bit of insight. I mean, obviously, I think NREL has a substantial amount of amazing tools that are available. In fact, I mean that's where Jared Wright is at the moment, and I know he's working on some really interesting sector coupled work in the US. They're using some in-house NREL tools. From our side, the only kind of NREL information we're using at the moment is we often use their ATB reports for information around learning rates for different technologies in terms of capital and operating costs. And then we also make use of tools like System Advisor Model for resource assessments of solar PV and wind plants. But in terms of the actual system modeling and optimization framework, that's what we use PyPSA for, which is a platform that NREL do. They've got their own platforms for that.
Cool. Okay, thanks. In the session today, we have Bruno Mervin and Paul Tucson. So both of you guys, please feel free to come in, and then several people from Tetra Tech. I see Dean and Taryn online as well. I'll just answer a question, then please, from the audience, let's have one as well. Peter, my understanding of these sort of planning models is that they really are about your code and your data, and then how you set the model up and under what scenario you use the model. So it really is all about that set of assumptions as well that goes into those scenarios. And if you take those sort of combinations of things, you end up with a fairly wide range of complexity that you have to then tame into kind of a set of required solutions. What is your approach to sort of managing errors and so on within that complexity?
Yeah, I think great question. In the first kind of in terms of some of that complexity, I think this is why we're really a big fan of exploring the solution space. So for a very specific set of input assumptions, you get a single data point result. But often, and I think there's a growing trend of papers coming out from Europe that are doing these kind of studies, is saying, okay, but within a certain cost range, so let's say it's 1% or 0.5% more in terms of cost, you could really have a completely different looking energy system that maybe wasn't the exact point that the optimizer found, but it can achieve a whole lot of different sort of criteria as well that you would like to see in your energy plan. So I think there is definitely something to be said for models that have so much complexity that it just takes an entire week or 2 weeks to solve. And often kind of these simpler models that can, it's not necessarily you are making a lot of simplifying assumptions, but these models are solving really quickly, and you can explore really a wide range of input parameters and get a feel for kind of what are the key trigger points and what really can make a huge difference. In terms of input errors and so forth, I mean, I think it's really one of the main challenges around going the open source route. It is incredibly easy to make a mistake, and you can, because you are not kind of through a user interface connecting up blocks, if you have the wrong code in the wrong place, you can easily get the wrong answer. But I think that's why it's so critical to have a community that is working on code, rather than kind of each individual person developing their own model. Sometimes it's really great to have your models out there, and they can be fully interrogated by anyone. So people can use them for their own studies, or they can also say, wait a minute, here's a bug. And I think in that sense, development happens a lot quicker in the open source space. And also new features. I mean, you can have a whole bunch of developers now working around the world, advancing the code and moving it forward a lot quicker.
Thanks, Peter. I see we've got a hand up from Bruno Mervin. Bruno, would you like to go?
Hi, Peter. Thanks for the very interesting presentation. I was just wondering, in terms of your spatially disaggregated model, whether you've looked at using a more aggregated spatial version than the 28 ESCOM supply regions. I think if you look at the more recent TDP, it seems like ESCOM transmission is converging towards using I think it's called ESCOM supply areas, which are more kind of more or less aligned with the provincial boundaries. I mean, this is we're with a student, we're busy developing a spatially disaggregated model for dispatch in FlexTool developed by Arena, and we were going to go with the PyPSA structure, but then when we started to gather data, we realized, and started running the model, we realized that if we wanted to do full chronology and try and get data like profile setup that we might do better with a slightly more aggregate spatial version. So just something for you to think about. I mean, I know the temptation is to just go with PyPSA as it is, but I'm not sure how far you've got trying to collect data on supply and demand. Yeah, there's an interesting trade-off there to be made, which you should perhaps look at before you get too far down the line. Otherwise, we'd be happy to compare notes once you're advanced a little bit further. We should meet up since we're both in Cape Town.
Yeah, no, fantastic. I think obviously kind of we're starting with the base model that already exists within for PyPSA-ZA, which was done based on the different Eskom supply areas. And so far we've been sort of playing around with the temporal aggregation. So obviously you can get quite a lot of computational savings by not running full chronology, but then running into some of the storage headaches to get the storage optimization right. But yeah, I mean, I think perhaps a simpler spatial aggregation model could yield useful information without kind of adding too much computational effort. I think really, yeah, the main challenge is how do you take this model that's now just runs for a single year, and we initially targeting kind of 5-year steps up to 2040, and yeah, we haven't thrown that yet at the optimizer, so we wait with bated breath to see how well it can cope with that.
Yeah, on that front, we're planning to use 2 separate models. One where you have the aggregated for doing capacity expansion. You have your aggregate temporal kind of representative of weeks, and then you test that with your higher temporal and perhaps spatial also. And the capacity expansion on both generation and transmission is quite a wicked problem.
Yeah. So we have got to the point where we've done a single node capacity expansion, and that runs with full chronology in 2-year steps. So we're using Express as our solver, and it was pretty quick. It was sort of less than half an hour to solve. But that's without the spatial information.
Yeah, it's interesting listening to the back and forth here. It seems like there's enough interest here to have an interest group within South Africa just on this topic alone. And certainly the time that we have here doesn't do it justice. Many thanks for the inputs. I've got a question from Paul Tucson. Paul, you're welcome to come in and voice your question if you want.
Thanks very much, and congrats, Peter. I think it was a brilliant study, and I think it provides a lot of guidance to policymakers and the country as a whole. Well done to you and your team. We did a study recently on in a country, and it's incredible how much renewable energy you can get if you actually capture all the rooftop spaces, including carports, rooftops, warehouse, industries, etc., etc. And it just pains me that the legislation is not in place to incentivize rooftop, because that could probably provide that 5 gigawatts. I wouldn't say overnight, but pretty quickly if the necessary incentives were in place. My second question is, I'm not sure of the precise number, but it's in the order of 5 gigawatts of shovel-ready RE projects are waiting in the Northern Cape, but they can't proceed because there's no transmission capacity. And I just, I don't know who you interface with in Eskom, but it just seems a travesty that those projects aren't proceeding because of transmission constraints in the Northern Cape, people not wanting transmission on their farms. And then my last question is a technical question. Are there scripts already written to handle capacity reserve in PyPSA. Thanks.
Okay, great. I'll start with the last question first. Yeah, so I mean, so we obviously from reserves, there's kind of the two aspects. So the one is operating reserves, and then kind of your reserve margin as well. So in the kind of default PyPSA as it is, there was code for reserve margin, but not necessarily capturing the kind of your instantaneous and regulating in 10-minute reserve. So that is something that we custom coded into our dispatch model. But I mean, that is the great thing about having this kind of open source platform, is it's quite easy then to customize constraints as you need them, as long as you stay within the linear world. Obviously, anything non-linear becomes a lot more tricky to deal with, and often you have to rather do an iterative solving approach for that. Yeah, that the transmission issue as well. It's there's a societal aspect to it as well. So what will society accept in terms of specific infrastructure, what is least cost, and what is the kind of balance between them. I know from Meridian side, a lot of the proposals around the just transition transaction and some of this kind of financing that the country is looking for, is that there really needs to be a significant focus on grid strengthening and how some of that funding can be leveraged to really unlock some of the opportunities on the grid. Yeah, and I think from the kind of customer feed-in perspective, I think the landscape is changing very quickly. I think the increasing number of traders coming into the space, as well as kind of Eskom looking at least with the industrial customers, net billing opportunities, so where they can feed into the grid. And I think it's going to be great when hopefully that can feed down to the smaller rooftop and the kind of commercial and residential spaces as well. From what we're seeing with our energy planning models is we just finished one for quite a large mining operation, and the size of the plant almost doubles by whether you assign a moderate value to the excess energy or not. So it's not even that you have to get compensated at grid tariffs. It's really you're talking anywhere between 30 and 50 cents a kilowatt hour. The business case could literally increase the deployment by tens of megawatts to do that. And I think we are in a position of needing as many customers in that kind of 100 megawatt space to install as bigger plants as possible. And having that value for excess energy is really a critical part of the system sizing. So whether that's from Eskom possibly allowing banking across the year instead of sort of within time of use periods for just a month, if they could mop up that excess energy, or traders stepping in and starting to grab these bits of energy that would otherwise be curtailed.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. And I have a question here from Tristan, second last question perhaps. He was talking about the linkages to SAP modeling. Tristan, do you want to clarify that?
Yeah, I was just modeling the other countries in the Southern African region.
So imports and exports?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is kind of one of the targets that the PyPSA Meets Africa initiative is looking at. I mean, the idea with that kind of continental-wide model is you don't necessarily have to solve for the full continental model. You can limit it to a specific subset of countries and then co-optimize resources across that portfolio. At the moment, we kind of our initial focus is getting the South African model up and going. But definitely, yeah, I think next steps would be really how can we tie in with what's happening in PyPSA Meets Africa already without really having to rejig too much of the modeling effort. But there are tons of different open source codes. I know there's a paper coming out soon from the team at GridPath who looked at the SAP, and they trying to remember. So GridPath is essentially developed by the team at, I think it's E3 Energy or 3E, or can't remember offhand, but they did a lot of work using the Resolve tool to do resource planning in California. So they've kind of now gone out and have their own tool available, which is a little bit, they've tried to write a bit of a front end for it, so it's more similar to Plexos. So yeah, I think there's an increasing, if we see from PyPSA Europe, the value of looking kind of beyond just a single country and some of the co-optimization that can happen. Definitely great potential there. I think we're still learning to walk a bit and trying to get our South African version going in the meantime.
Yeah, thanks. And last question from me, if I may. Unless there's a question from the floor. If there's a burning question from the floor, please raise your hand and let's hear you. Okay, thanks. I have nothing at the moment. Peter, the interesting thing from my side is the penetration of renewables. It seems at the moment that we are getting sort of a greater and greater stock of renewables out there, self-gen, etc., etc. But it's almost like we are losing track of these individuals and the contribution that they might bring to the network. And part of that is possibly a lack of a trading floor in a way. And the other side is just I kind of feel that we're not tracking them properly. As a mine installs renewables and self-generates more, something is happening there, and it's not necessarily visible at a national level. Does that then go towards our national generation score, the self-generation at a mine, or does it just come off the demand and then it becomes invisible? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so I mean, at the moment, the way we've approached it is, if you can see on these graphs, so essentially the sort of orange colors, the utility scale, and then we're including contributions from distributed generators themselves. So hopefully, at least with the larger plants going in the sort of 100 megawatt space, that hopefully from registration processes, we're going to get kind of accurate tracking of that installed capacity that is going in. And I think from a kind of load research perspective as well, there's probably quite a lot of interesting work that can be done in terms of mining historical profiles and kind of comparing them and using some kind of machine learning to say, okay, well, we're starting to see now we're getting a drop midday, which we weren't seeing a year ago, and that's kind of indicative of on-site solar PV, for example. So hopefully the larger plants will be tracked quite closely, but yeah, I think going down to much smaller plants, it becomes a real task to try track that. Some of the more interesting approaches that I've seen is trying to look at, for example, imports of solar panels and kind of roughly equating how much was paid to the volumes that are coming into the country, and then subtracting how much of those volumes would be going to utility work, and then kind of placing that within the distributed market to try and get a feel for what those numbers are. But I think once people can, I think once there's an incentive to perhaps feed your excess back into the grid, then I think the visibility of some of those plants will hopefully, become a bit higher.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I was just concerned about the ability of our authorities to, gather all that necessary information and render it in a form that's useful for those who have to put the sums together.
Yeah.
But one of the further considerations, sorry, it's just a final comment actually, is your scenario of 1% load growth. I worry about that because that's almost a scenario of death for South Africa. If you take that across to GDP, it means that we're generating unemployed people faster than we're generating employed people, surely.
Yeah, so I mean, you'll see in the results the 1% load growth, the levels of load shedding around that are staggering, I think, in the kind of current analysis. So yeah, if that's initially what we were planning against, then you can see the just massive amounts of capacity that has to be brought on in a very short period of time just to cover that up to 2026. So above that, it obviously percentage growth in demand is another so many terawatt hours that has to be supplied from somewhere.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Thank you so much for coming online to present today. I didn't expect so many people, and I think this will serve as a very valuable reference to members of the SAIEE in future to brief themselves on the state of the art. I take my hat off to you and to those members of the audience that came online to contribute here. I think there is grounds in future for a working group of sorts, or an interest group at least within South Africa, on matters of national planning. And the more folk that we have online, certainly the more confidence we can have in the results thereof. It has been a little bit hidden at some stages in our past, and to get that visibility while it's happening, I think could be very good. So thanks again from my side, and we are getting many thanks flowing through from the audience, so much appreciated. Folks, that's all from my side, and if there's any final comments or questions, please voice now. Peter, we have nothing more than thank yous, so your job is done.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for input. Appreciate it.
Maybe I'll share the slide deck and my email address if anyone wants to reach out. And as I say, I mean, I'm still learning the ropes on this open source myself, so happy to share the little knowledge I have so far.
No, I'm sure there'll be great interest. We will take your slide deck and post it with the video on the SAIEE website. And for our members, we'll share your email address, and I hope that will suffice.
Great stuff. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, we'll close the meeting now. Cheers, everyone. Thanks so much.